April 13, 1943. Deep inside a wooden hut at Pearl Harbor, a team of Navy cryptanalysts stared at a freshly decoded Japanese transmission. The message was routine, just another inspection tour notification. But the name attached to it made every person in that room freeze. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, would be flying to the Solomon Islands in 5 days. The message included departure times, arrival times, even the number of escort fighters. It was the kind of intelligence windfall that appears once in a war if you're lucky. Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimtz's intelligence officer, immediately understood what they had. Yamamoto wasn't just any Japanese officer. He was the beating heart of the Imperial Navy, the mind behind every major operation in the Pacific, and now they knew exactly where he'd be, down to the minute. Layton rushed the decoded message to Nimtz's office, his hands probably shaking. This wasn't just actionable intelligence. This was a chance to decapitate the enemy's command structure with a single strike. Nimtz read the message twice. Then he looked up at Layton and asked the question that would define the operation. Can we get him? Not should we, can we? The moral calculation had already been made. Yamamoto had planned the attack that killed 2,043 Americans on December 7, 1941. The families of those sailors were still grieving. This was payback, pure and simple. But wanting to kill Yamamoto and actually doing it were separated by roughly 1,000 miles of enemy-controlled ocean and jungle. The intercept revealed he'd be flying from Rabaul to Bali airfield near Bougainville on April 18th. Rabaul was the most heavily fortified Japanese base in the South Pacific, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and surrounded by hundreds of Zero fighters. There was no way to hit him there. The only vulnerable moment would be during the flight itself, a window of maybe 90 minutes when he'd be exposed in the air. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had to authorize the mission personally. Killing a military commander was legal under the laws of war. But this was different. This was targeted assassination based on signals intelligence. And if it went wrong, if the Japanese realized their codes were compromised, the Allies would lose their most valuable asset in the Pacific. Every intercepted message since early 1942 had been thanks to the code rear's work on JN-25, the Japanese naval cipher. One failed assassination attempt could shut down that entire intelligence pipeline. Knox gave the green light on April 14th. He'd accepted the risk. Now the problem shifted to the tactical level, and that's where things got complicated. Bougainville was 435 mi from Guadalcanal, the nearest Allied airbase with fighters. The Standard Army Air Force's fighter, the P-39 Arakko Cobra, had a combat radius of maybe 200 meters. It couldn't even make it halfway. The Navy's F-4F Wildcats, same problem. There was only one aircraft in the Pacific theater with the range to pull this off. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was a strange-looking bird. Twin engines mounted on twin booms with a cockpit sitting in a central NL between them. It looked like two planes welded together, but those twin Allison engines gave it something no other fighter in the theater could match: range. With drop tanks mounted under the wings, a P-38 could theoretically fly 900 meters and still have enough fuel to fight and make it home. Theoretically, nobody had actually tried to push them that far over open water. The mission fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group stationed on Guadalcanal. These were veteran pilots who'd been flying combat missions since the island was secured in February. They knew the P-38 inside and out, knew its quirks and its limits, and now they were being asked to exceed every one of those limits for a single target. Major John Mitchell, the squadron's operations officer, would lead the mission. He immediately started running calculations. Distance, airspeed, fuel consumption, time over target. The math was brutal. They'd be flying at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar, which meant higher fuel consumption. They'd need external drop tanks, and they'd have to navigate 435 meters without radio communication. One wrong turn, and they'd end up over empty ocean with no fuel to make it back. Mitchell requested 18. P-38, 16 would be the strike force, with 4 designated as the killer flight that would actually engage. Yamamoto's plane and 12 flying top cover to handle the Zero escorts. 2 additional planes would serve as spares in case anyone had mechanical issues during the flight out. Every aircraft would be carrying full ammunition and 2 310-gallon drop tanks. The total weight would push the P-38s to their absolute performance limits. The pilots weren't told who the target was initially. They just knew it was big. maybe the biggest mission any of them would ever fly. The briefing was set for April 17th, the day before the mission. Until then, ground crews worked around the clock, checking every rivet, every fuel line, every engine cylinder. One mechanical failure at the wrong moment, and this whole operation would collapse. The intelligence was gold. The plan was desperate. And somewhere out there, Admiral Yamamoto was packing his dress uniform for an inspection tour, completely unaware that 18 American fighters were about to fly 1,000 miles just to kill him. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, a small city in northern Japan. His original family name was Takano, but he was adopted at age 32 into the Yamamoto family, a common practice for samurai lineages without male heirs. The name Isoroku meant 56, his father's age when he was born. It was an unusual name that would become legendary, though not in the way his parents imagined. By 1943, he was the most recognizable military figure in Japan, more famous than the emperor himself in some ways. Soldiers worshipped him, civilians trusted him, and the Americans wanted him dead more than any other person in the Japanese military hierarchy. His path to Pearl Harbor started decades earlier in a way most Americans would find ironic. Yamamoto studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, learning English and absorbing American culture. He traveled across the United States, visiting oil fields in Texas and automobile factories in Detroit. What he saw terrified him. America's industrial capacity was staggering, almost incomprehensible compared to Japan's. He watched Ford assembly lines churning out cars at rates Japanese factories couldn't match for any product. He saw oil derricks pulling millions of barrels from the ground. He understood something most Japanese military leaders refused to accept. If Japan ever went to war with America, it would be industrial capacity, not fighting spirit, that decided the outcome. When he returned to Japan, he became one of the Navy's most vocal opponents of war with the United States. In meetings with senior leadership throughout the 1930s, Yamamoto repeatedly argued that Japan couldn't win a prolonged conflict. He'd seen Detroit. He knew what American factories could do once they switched from making cars to making tanks and planes. His most famous quote came in 1940 after Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. "If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year. But I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years." It wasn't defeatism, it was math. Japan's entire annual steel production roughly equaled what American factories produced in a single month. But when the Japanese government decided on war anyway, Yamamoto followed orders. He was a military officer, not a politician. If Japan was going to fight America, he'd make sure the opening blow was devastating enough to buy time for a negotiated peace. That's where Pearl Harbor came from. Not bloodlust or hatred of Americans, but cold strategic calculation. He needed to the U.S. Pacific Fleet so thoroughly that America would spend months, maybe years, rebuilding. During that time, Japan would fortify its conquered territories and create a defensive perimeter so costly to breach that the Americans would negotiate rather than fight. The attack on December 7, 1941, achieved most of its tactical objectives. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,400 Americans killed, hundreds of aircraft wiped out on the ground. But Yamamoto immediately recognized the operation's critical failure. The American aircraft carriers weren't in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea. He'd sunk battleships, which were already becoming obsolete, while the weapons that would actually decide the Pacific War, carriers, remained intact. Worse, he'd unified American public opinion overnight. The isolationist movement collapsed. Congress declared war within 24 hours. Every factory in America retooled for war production. He'd awakened the industrial giant he'd spent years warning about. Still, Yamamoto remained Japan's most effective naval commander. He planned the Indian Ocean raid that terrorized British forces in early 1942. He conceived the operation to capture Midway Island, which should have drawn out the remaining American carriers for destruction. But Midway in June 1942 became the turning point. American code rears, the same ones who'd intercept his flight itinerary 10 months later, provided Admiral Nimitz with Yamamoto's complete battle plan. The U.S. carriers ambushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 carriers in a single day. Yamamoto's force limped back to Japan, having lost the core of its striking power. The 6-month window he'd predicted had closed. Now came the grinding war of attrition he'd always feared. By April 1943, the strategic situation had deteriorated further. Guadalcanal had fallen to American forces in February, after 6 months of brutal fighting. Japan was losing the Solomon Islands campaign. Yamamoto decided a personal morale visit was necessary. His staff warned against flying so close to enemy lines, but he'd built his reputation on sharing danger with frontline troops. Japanese soldiers expected their commanders to lead from the front. Canceling the tour would signal weakness and fear, so he approved the itinerary his staff had prepared. April 18th, depart Rabaul at 6 a.m., arrive Ballet at 8 a.m., inspect units, then continue to other bases throughout the day. The Americans reading his decoded schedule couldn't believe their luck. Yamamoto's obsession with punctuality was well known throughout the Japanese military. If the message said 8 a.m. arrival, he'd arrive at 8 a.m. You could set your watch by him. That precision, that predictability, it was about to kill him. Intelligence analysts calculated his exact flight path. Navigation officers plotted interception points. And fighter pilots in Guadalcanal started studying maps of Bougainville, wondering why they were suddenly so interested in this one particular island. President Roosevelt himself was briefed on the operation. Some advisors worried about the president. Would this make American commanders targets for similar assassination missions? Roosevelt dismissed the concern. Yamamoto had military command. He wore a uniform. He planned operations. He was a legitimate target under every definition of the laws of war. The mission was authorized at the highest levels, which meant if it failed, if pilots were captured, if the code-reeking secret was exposed, the blame would flow all the way to the White House. Roosevelt accepted that risk. Pearl Harbor was still burning in America's collective memory. The man who'd planned that attack was about to board a plane, and the United States was about to turn that plane into his coffin. Major John Mitchell spread theme-maps across the briefing table on April 17th and started explaining to his pilots why this mission was going to be different from anything they'd flown before. The target wasn't a base or a convoy. It was one man on one airplane, and he'd be over enemy territory in approximately 16 hours. The room went silent when Mitchell revealed the target's identity. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Every pilot in that room had lost friends on December 7th or knew someone who had. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal, but personal motivation wouldn't get them to Bougainville and back. Physics would determine that. Mitchell had spent 2 days working through fuel calculations with engineering officers, and the numbers were terrifying. Guadalcanal to the interception point near Bougainville was 435 mi over open ocean. The P-38 Lightning standard combat radius was roughly 350 millinautical. They'd be flying 85 miles beyond the aircraft's published capabilities, and that assumed perfect conditions. No headwinds, no combat maneuvering, no getting lost. One navigation error, and 16 aircraft would ditch in the ocean with no hope of rescue. The Japanese controlled everything between Guadalcanal and Bougainville. There would be no friendly ships, no search planes, no second chances. The solution was drop tanks. Big 3 10-gallon external fuel tanks bolted under each wing, with 2 tanks per aircraft. Each P-38 would carry an additional 620 gal beyond its internal fuel capacity. But those tanks created their own problems. They were heavy, they increased drag, and worst of all, they were notoriously unreliable. Pilots had reported tanks that wouldn't feed properly, valves that stuck, connections that leaked. If a drop tank malfunctioned during the flight out, that pilot would have to turn back immediately or risk running dry before reaching home. Mitchell couldn't afford to lose aircraft to mechanical failures. He needed every plane that took off to make it to the target area. The route itself was a masterpiece of navigation planning. Mitchell plotted a course that would keep them over water the entire way, avoiding Japanese coastal radar stations on New Georgia and Vella La Vella. They'd fly at wave-top level, literally 50 ft above the ocean to stay under enemy radar coverage, but flying that low for over 2 hours meant pilots would have no visual landmarks, just endless blue water in every direction. Dead reckoning navigation was all they'd have. Mitchell would lead using a Navy compass he'd borrowed specifically for this mission, checking their heading every few minutes against a meticulously prepared flight plan. If his compass was off by even 2 degrees, they'd miss Bougainville entirely and end up over empty ocean with empty tanks. Radio silence was mandatory. No transmissions until after the attack. The Japanese had listening posts scattered throughout the Solomons, and any radio chatter would alert them that American fighters were inbound. So 18 P-38s would fly in formation for 435 miles without saying a word to each other. Hand signals only. If someone developed engine trouble, they'd waggle their wings and peel off. No calling for help, no status updates. Just silent running all the way to the target. The interception timing had to be perfect. Intelligence reported Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. local time in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, what the Americans called a Betty. He'd have an escort of 6 fighters. Flight time from Rabaul to Balali was approximately 2 hours, which meant Yamamoto's plane would arrive over Bougainville's southern coast around 8 light. Mitchell's strike force would need to take off from Guadalcanal at 7:10 a.m., fly for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and arrive at the interception point at 9:35 a.m. Wait, that didn't work. The math was wrong. Someone had forgotten about the time zone difference. Bougainville operated on Tokyo time, 1 hour ahead of Guadalcanal. They recalculated the P-38s would need to launch at 7:25 a.m., Guadalcanal time to intercept Yamamoto at 9:35 a.m. Bougainville time. A 1-hour mistake would have put them over empty ocean, while Yamamoto landed safely. Mitchell divided his 18 P-38s into 2 flights. The killer flight, 4 aircraft designated to engage Yamamoto's bomber directly, would be led by Captain Thomas Lanfear. The other 3 pilots in the killer flight were Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Jim Lanahan, and Lieutenant Joe Moore. Their job was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Identify which of the 2 Betty bombers was carrying Yamamoto, shoot it down, and confirm the kill. The decoded message indicated 2 bombers would be flying together, identical in appearance. One carried Yamamoto, the other carried his staff. The Americans would need to destroy both to ensure success. The remaining 14 P-38s would fly top cover under Mitchell's command, staying high to engage the Zero escorts. Those Zeros were the mission's biggest tactical threat. The Mitsubishi A6M was more maneuverable than the P-38 at low altitude. And these wouldn't be rookie pilots. Yamamoto's escort would be experienced veterans, probably hand-picked from elite fighter units. Mitchell's cover flight would need to keep those Zeros busy long enough for the killer flight to complete their attack and escape. If the Zeros got through to the killer flight during the critical attack phase, the whole mission could collapse into a dogfight, where fuel calculations meant nothing and luck meant everything. Equipment checks consumed the afternoon of April 17th. Armorers loaded every P-38 with full ammunition, 4 50 caliber machine guns, and 1 20mm cannon in the nose. Ground crews tested every drop tank connection twice. Mechanics ran up engines and checked magnetos. Flight surgeons handed out amphetamine pills, Benzedrine, to help pilots stay alert during the long overwater flight. Some pilots took them, others declined. Mitchell briefed alternate plans for every contingency he could imagine. If they arrived early, they'd orbit out of sight. If they arrived late, they'd abort. If the Zeros engaged before they reached the bombers, top cover would hold them while the killer flight dove for the targets. If both bombers went down before they could confirm which carried Yamamoto, they'd strafe both crash sites to ensure no survivors. Weather reports for April 18th looked acceptable. Scattered clouds, light winds, good visibility. The mission was officially approved at 8 p.m. on April 17th. Mitchell told his pilots to get sleep. Reveille would be 500 a.m., breakfast at 5:30, final briefing at 6:30, engines start at 7:15. This was happening. After all the planning and calculations and worry about fuel and navigation and timing, it came down to 18 P-38s, 36 Allison engines, and roughly 11,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Either the math worked or it didn't. Either they'd find Yamamoto, or they wouldn't. Either they'd make it home or they'd be swimming. In 12 hours, they'd know which. Rex Barber wasn't supposed to be famous. He was a quiet farm kid from Culver, Oregon, population 800, who joined the Army Air Corps in 1940 because it seemed more interesting than raising cattle. He wasn't flashy like some of the other pilots. Didn't tell wild stories in the officers' club. Didn't strut around like he owned the sky. He just flew his aircraft well and shot straight. By April 1943, he had 2 confirmed kills and a reputation for being steady under fire. Steady was good. Steady kept you alive. But steady doesn't make headlines. And what was about to happen over Bougainville would turn Rex Barber into the center of one of World War II's most bitter controversies. Thomas Lanier was everything Barber wasn't. Tall, handsome, articulate. the son of a decorated World War I pilot. Lanier had charisma that filled a room. He was the guy reporters wanted to interview, the pilot who looked perfect in recruiting posters. He'd scored 2 kills before the Yamamoto mission and carried himself like someone destined for greater things. When Mitchell assigned Lanfear to lead the killer flight, it made sense. Lanier had leadership presence. But leadership presence and accurate after-action reporting turned out to be 2 very different skills, and that disconnect would poison the rest of both men's lives. The other 2 pilots in the killer flight brought their own strengths. Jim Malanahan was methodical and precise, a by-the-book aviator who followed procedures religiously. Joe Moore was aggressive, always pushing his aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope. 4 different personalities, 4 different flying styles, all crammed into a 4-ship formation with one job: find Yamamoto's bomber and kill it. The problem that nobody fully appreciated during the April 17th briefing was that 4 pilots attacking the same target from different angles in the middle of a high-speed engagement would see 4 completely different battles. And when they landed back at Guadalcanal, they'd tell 4 completely different stories. Barber had joined the 339th Fighter Squadron in October 1942, right when the Guadalcanal campaign was reaching its brutal peak. His early missions were bomber, escorts, and combat air patrols, the unglamorous work of trying to protect transport ships and ground installations from Japanese air raids. He scored his first kill on January 27, 1943, a 0 that made the mistake of diving through his formation. The second kill came in March, another 0 during a swirling dogfight over Renova Island. Neither victory was spectacular. He didn't flame the enemy or send them spinning into the ocean in dramatic corkscrews. He just put bullets into vital components until the aircraft stopped flying. Effective, but not exciting. Nobody wrote news articles about effective. Lanfear's combat record was similar in numbers, but different in style. He was more aggressive, more willing to break formation to pursue a target. That aggressiveness worried some of the other pilots. Fighter combat required discipline. You stayed with your wingman. You followed the flight leader. You didn't go lone wolf chasing personal glory because lone wolves got shot down by enemies they never saw coming. But Lanier got results. And in combat, results excused a lot of questionable decisions. Mitchell knew Lanfear's tendencies when he assigned him to lead the killer flight. Maybe he thought Lanier's aggressiveness would be an asset when attacking the bombers. Maybe he just needed someone with confidence bordering on arrogance to lead what was essentially a suicide mission. Either way, the decision was made. The flight plan put enormous pressure on split-second decision-making. After the 2-hour overwater navigation leg, the killer flight would have maybe 30 seconds to identify the target bombers, position for attack, and execute before the 0 escorts reacted. 30 seconds. In that window, flying at 300 mph, covering 5 meters, 4 pilots would need to coordinate an attack on 2 identical aircraft while 6 enemy fighters tried to kill them. There was no time for discussion, no time for radio calls asking which bomber should I hit. Each pilot would make independent decisions based on what he saw in front of him. And what you see in combat depends entirely on where you are when the shooting starts. Training had prepared them for the mechanics of air combat, but not for the chaos. Gunnery practice taught you to lead a target to account for bullet drop and convergence range. Formation flying taught you to maintain position relative to your flight lead. Combat missions taught you that enemy pilots shot back, and physics didn't care about your training. But nothing prepared you for the mental strain of flying 1,000 mi round trip on the edge of fuel exhaustion to kill one specific person you'd never met. This wasn't abstract warfare. This was assassination. The target had a name, a face, a biography everyone had studied. Pilots knew Yamamoto had attended Harvard. They knew he'd opposed the war initially. They knew he had a wife and children back in Tokyo. And then they pushed all that knowledge aside because sentiment didn't matter. He'd planned Pearl Harbor. That was the only fact that counted. The night before the mission, Barber wrote a letter to his family. He didn't mention where he was going or what he'd be doing. Censorship rules forbade operational details, but the tone was different from his usual correspondence. More reflective, he talked about duty and sacrifice and hoping the war would end soon. It read like someone who understood he might not be coming back. Plenty of pilots wrote similar letters before dangerous missions, Most of them returned safely and never mailed the letters. Some didn't return, and the letters became final messages. Barber sealed his in an envelope and left it with the squadron clerk just in case. Lanier spent the evening differently. He held court in the officers' club, talking confidently about the mission, projecting calm assurance that everything would go according to plan. Some pilots found his confidence reassuring. Others thought he was tempting fate. There's an old superstition among combat aviators. The guys who brag loudest before a mission are the ones who don't come back. But Lanier wasn't bragging exactly. He genuinely believed in his abilities and in the mission. He'd studied the target photos, memorized the Betty bomber silhouette, rehearsed the attack profile in his mind 100 times. He was ready. They were all ready. And in 10 hours, they'd find out if ready was enough. Sleep came hard for most of the pilots that night. You'd close your eyes and see fuel gauges dropping toward empty. You'd calculate miles and minutes and gallons until the numbers blurred together. Some pilots gave up trying to sleep and just sat, outside their tents, smoking cigarettes and watching the stars. The jungle around Henderson Field buzzed with insects. Somewhere in the darkness, Japanese positions on the northern part of Guadalcanal were probably watching those same stars. And 600m northwest at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto was presumably sleeping peacefully, unaware that tomorrow morning's routine inspection flight would be anything but routine. The Americans knew his schedule down to the minute. They knew his route. They knew his altitude. They had every advantage except certainty, and certainty was the one thing you never got in combat. You just strapped in, started the engines, and found out what happened. In 6 hours, Rex Barber would be doing exactly that. The engines came to life at 7:15 a.m. on April 18, 1943. 18. Allison V-1710s scoffed blue smoke and settled into their characteristic throaty rumble. Ground crews pulled chocks from the wheels and gave thumbs-up signals. Pilots ran through final checks, fuel gauges reading full with drop tanks feeding properly, gun switches armed, compass headings verified against Mitchell's master navigation plan. At 7:25 a.m. Precisely, Mitchell's P-38 rolled forward, picked up, speed down Henderson Field's packed coral runway and lifted into the humid air. 17 more followed at 15-second intervals. Within 5 minutes, all 18 fighters were airborne and forming up over Guadalcanal's southern coast. The formation headed northwest, climbing to 10,000 ft initially before Mitchell brought them down to wavetop level. Flying at 50 ft above the ocean sounds dramatic in briefings but feels suicidal in practice. One moment of inattention, one small error in altitude control, and your propellers kiss salt water at 200 miles per hour. The ocean rushes past underneath in a blue-gray blur. There's no time to react if something goes wrong. You fly by instrument and instinct, trusting your eyes and your aircraft and hoping neither betrays you. Mitchell held the lead position, checking his compass every few minutes against the flight plan strapped to his knee. Behind him, the formation stretched out in a loose string, each pilot keeping visual contact with the plane ahead while scanning the horizon for any sign of Japanese aircraft. 20 minutes into the flight, Joe Moore's drop tanks refused to feed. He tried switching valves, adjusting fuel pressure, everything the manual suggested. Nothing worked. His internal tanks showed fuel draining while the externals stayed full, which meant he'd run dry long before reaching Bougainville. He waggled his wings, the signal for mechanical trouble, and peeled away, heading back to Guadalcanal. The killer flight was down to 3 aircraft. Mitchell watched Moore depart and had to make an instant decision. Abort the mission or continue with reduced strength, he continued. They'd come too far and the target was too valuable to turn back now. 40 minutes out, Jim Mullanahan developed the same problem. His drop tanks wouldn't feed either. Whatever mechanical gremlin had plagued Moore's aircraft had found Mullanahan too. He went through the same troubleshooting steps, got the same useless results, and made the same painful decision to turn back. Now the killer flight was down to 2 aircraft, Lanfear and Barber. 2 P-38s to find and destroy 2 Japanese bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Mitchell briefly considered aborting. 2 planes seemed too few for the mission profile, but they were already 150 miles from Guadalcanal. Turning back now meant wasting fuel and intelligence and opportunity. The mission continued. The flight settled into the monotony of overwater navigation. Blue water below, blue sky above, the sun climbing steadily toward its noon zenith. No landmarks, no reference points, just Mitchell's compass and his calculated headings. Pilots fought drowsiness from the engine drone and the benzodrine wearing off. Some sang songs in their heads. Others counted minutes and mentally calculated fuel consumption. At this power setting, burning this much fuel per hour, they should have X gallons remaining at the 1 hour mark. E gallons at 90 minutes. Every pilot ran his own calculations, comparing his gauges against the numbers in his head, looking for discrepancies that would mean trouble. So far, everything matched the flight plan, but so far still meant they were 200 miles from home with 235 mi yet to fly. At 9:33 a.m. Bougainville time, 1 hour and 43 minutes after takeoff, Doug Canning and Mitchell's flight spotted land. A thin gray line on the northwestern horizon, barely visible through the haze. Bougainville. Mitchell checked his watch and his position. They were 2 minutes early, and roughly 5 miles south of the planned interception point. That was extraordinary navigation. 435 mi over featureless ocean, and they'd hit their mark within 2 minutes and 5 mi. Mitchell signaled the formation to turn north and climb. The top cover flight followed him up to 18,000 Dalsiat, and Lanier and Barber stayed low, accelerating toward the coast. At 9:34 a.m., Lanier spotted aircraft. 2 Betty bombers in a shallow descent toward Bal Airfield, exactly as intelligence had predicted. 6 fighters flying cover above them and 2 3-plane elements. The Japanese were right where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. Yamamoto's obsession with punctuality had delivered him to his execution with perfect timing. Lanier rocked his wings, the signal for enemy sighted, and pushed his throttles forward. Barber followed, closing the distance. The range was about 10 mi and shrinking fast. The P-38s were at 50 ft, screaming toward the coast at 300 mph. The Betty bombers were at 4,500 ft descending. The geometry was perfect for a diving attack. Then everything went wrong at once. The Zero pilots spotted the P-38s. They dropped their external fuel tanks and dove toward the American fighters. Above them, Mitchell's cover flight engaged. P-38s climbing to meet the diving Zeros. The sky filled with aircraft turning, diving, firing. Lanfear pulled up to meet the Zeros head-on, his guns firing in short bursts. Barber stayed low, continuing toward the bombers. This wasn't the plan. The killer flight was supposed to attack together, while the cover flight held off the escorts. But combat plans disintegrate the moment enemy fighters show up, and now Lanfear and Barber were separated, fighting 2 different battles. The Betty bombers broke formation. The lead bomber, later identified as carrying Yamamoto, turned hard left toward the jungle, descending rapidly. The second bomber turned right, heading for cloud cover over the ocean. Barber locked onto the left-hand Betty, the one diving for the trees. He closed to 500 yards, then 300, then 100. His gun sight centered on the bomber's fuselage. The Betty's tail gunner opened fire, 20mm cannon shells arcing toward Barber's P-38. He ignored them, concentrating on his target. At 100 yards, he pressed the trigger. 450 caliber machine guns and a 120mm cannon erupted. The combined firepower, roughly 200 rounds per second, tore into the Betty's right engine and wing root. The bomber's right engine exploded in a ball of orange fire. The wing folded upward, broken by the sheer kinetic force of Barber's guns. The Betty rolled inverted and plunged into the jungle canopy at over 200 mph. Barber flashed overhead, pulling up hard to avoid flying through the explosion. He caught a glimpse of wreckage tumbling through the trees. Then he was past climbing, searching for the second bomber. Behind him, black smoke marked where Yamamoto's aircraft had died. Lanfear, meanwhile, had tangled with the Zeros. He'd fired at one, claimed hits, then dove away and spotted a Betty bomber below him. He attacked from above and behind, fired a long burst, saw the bomber smoking and claimed it destroyed. Then his aircraft shuddered. Zero fire had hit him and he dove for the deck, running for the ocean at full throttle with 2 Zeros pursuing. He barely made it to the coastline before the Zeros broke off. His P-38 was damaged, one engine running rough but still flying. Above the chaos, Mitchell's cover flight was fighting off the remaining Zeros. Lieutenant Besby Holmes chased the second Betty out over the ocean, firing until it crashed into the water 3 miles offshore. The entire engagement from first sighting to final crash lasted less than 4 minutes. Minutes of violence compressed into a tiny piece of sky above Bougainville's southern coast. And somewhere in the wreckage burning in the jungle below, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead. Though the Americans wouldn't confirm that for several more hours, they'd flown 1,000 miles to execute one man. They'd done it. Now they just had to get home on whatever fuel remained in their tanks. Rex Barber's hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline overload. His P-38 was climbing away from Bougainville's coast, the jungle now 3 miles behind him. And his mind was still processing what had just happened. He'd put roughly 40 rounds of 20mm cannon fire and maybe 150 rounds of 50 caliber into that Betty bomber. He'd watched the right engine disintegrate, watched the wing buckle, watched the entire aircraft roll inverted and auger into the trees. The image was burned into his vision. He could still see it when he blinked. The Betty tumbling, pieces flying off, the jungle reaching up to swallow it. The attack had lasted maybe 5 seconds from first trigger pull to impact. 5 seconds where everything moved in slow motion and hyperspeed simultaneously. Barber had closed from 500 YD to point-blank range. His finger clamped on the trigger, his aircraft bucking from the recoil of 5 guns firing in unison. The Betty's tail gunner had been shooting back. He remembered seeing the muzzle flashes, the tracers arcing toward him, but either the gunner missed or Barber's aircraft absorbed hits he hadn't noticed. Combat does that. Overwhelms your sensory system with so much information that some details just don't register. You process the immediate threats and ignore everything else. What made those 5 seconds particularly chaotic was the altitude. The Betty had been diving toward the jungle, trying to get low where the P-38s couldn't follow. Yamamoto's pilot must have pushed the yoke forward the instant he saw American fighters diving from 4,500 FT toward the tree canopy. Standard evasion tactic. Get low, use terrain masking. Make yourself a difficult target. But it hadn't worked. Barber had followed him down, matching the dive, closing the distance. By the time Barber opened fire, both aircraft were below 1,000 FT and still descending. The Betty was maybe 500 FT above the trees when the wing failed. It didn't have time to recover, just rolled over and went straight down into the green hell below. Barber had pulled up hard to avoid the same trees, his aircraft groaning under the G-forces, his vision tunneling as blood drained from his head. When he leveled out at 2,000 FT and looked back, he saw smoke rising from the crash site, a thick black column that marked the bombers' grave. No parachutes, no survivors. The Betty had hit too hard, too fast. Anyone inside was dead on impact. Barber didn't know he'd just killed the architect of Pearl Harbor. He just knew he'd splashed one enemy bomber and needed to find the second one before the Zeros found him. The second Betty was already dying. B.B. Holmes from the cover flight had chased it out over the ocean, firing steady bursts until the bomber's left engine caught fire and the aircraft nosed into the water. Holmes reported seeing it hit belly first, then cartwheel and break apart. The ocean swallowed it in seconds. 2 bombers, 2 kills, mission accomplished. But in the confusion of combat, nobody knew for certain which bomber carried which passengers. Intelligence had said Yamamoto would be in one of them. The Americans had destroyed both. Confirmation would have to wait for intelligence reports from coast watchers or captured documents. Lanfear's fight had been completely different. While Barber chased the Betty into the jungle, Lanier had climbed to meet the diving Zeros. He'd fired at one, claimed probable damage, then spotted a Betty bomber and dove on it from high altitude. His after-action report would later describe a textbook attack. Diving from above, opening fire at 300 yards, walking his bullets into the Betty's fuselage and engines until smoke poured out and the bomber went down. He claimed the Betty he'd attacked was the one that crashed in the jungle, the one carrying Yamamoto. This claim would become the center of a controversy that lasted 60 years. The problem was geometry. Barber and Lanier had approached the target area from different positions and attacked different bombers. Barber had stayed low and chased the left-hand Betty, the one diving toward the jungle. Lanfear had climbed to engage the Zeros, then dove on a Betty from above, which would have been the right-hand bomber heading toward the ocean. But both pilots reported their target crashed in the jungle. Both couldn't be right. Either they'd attacked the same bomber from different angles and both mistakenly claimed the kill, or they'd attacked different bombers, and one of them remembered the details wrong. Human memory under stress is notoriously unreliable. Pilots in combat experience time dilation, sensory overload, tunnel vision. What you remember happening and what actually happened can be completely different. Other pilots in the formation saw pieces of the fight, but not the whole picture. Doug Canning saw 2 bombers crash, one in the jungle, one in the ocean. He didn't see which P-38 shot which bomber. Lewis K.D. saw Lanfear firing at something, but couldn't tell if his bullets hit. Everyone agreed the mission succeeded. Both bombers were destroyed, but who killed which bomber remained unclear. The only certainty was that Admiral Yamamoto was dead. Japanese search parties would find his body the next day, still strapped in his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage by the impact. An army surgeon would examine the remains and determine Yamamoto had died from 2 bullet wounds, one in his left shoulder, one in his left jaw. Both wounds tracked from front to back and slightly downward, consistent with being fired from an aircraft attacking from behind and slightly above. Exactly the attack geometry Barber had used. The flight home was brutal. Mitchell had to maintain radio silence until they cleared Japanese-controlled airspace, which meant the first 90 minutes of the return flight were spent in tense quiet. Every pilot monitoring his fuel gauges and doing mental arithmetic. Drop tanks were empty now, feeding from internal tanks only. The math was tight. At cruise power settings, burning approximately 85 gall per hour per engine, a P-38's internal tanks carried about 410 gall total. They'd burned maybe 200 gallons to Bougainville, another 50 gallons during the combat. That left 160 gall for the return trip, which would take about 90 minutes. 90 minutes at 85 gall per hour per engine was roughly 255 gall. They were 95 gall short. The only solution was to lean the fuel mixture as much as possible and pray. Run the engines at the edge of their tolerance, accept rough running and reduced power, and hope they didn't quit entirely before Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon. 2 P-38s didn't make it. They ran dry 50 miles from Henderson Field and ditched in the ocean. Navy PT boats rescued both pilots, sunburned and exhausted, but alive. The other 14 aircraft landed at Guadalcanal between 12:15 and 12:30 p.m., their fuel gauges showing 0 or near 0. Ground crews swarmed the planes, helping pilots out of cramped cockpits, everyone shouting questions. Did you get him? Did Yamamoto go down? Mitchell confirmed both bombers destroyed, but couldn't say for certain which one carried the admiral. That information would take time to verify. For now, all they knew was the mission had succeeded tactically. They'd found the target. They'd executed the attack. They'd survived. The rest was intelligence work. The pilot stumbled to the debriefing tent, still wearing sweat-soaked flight suits, and started telling their stories. Lanier spoke first, describing his attack on a Betty bomber that crashed in the jungle after his gunfire set it ablaze. Barber spoke next, describing his low-altitude pursuit and the wing failure he'd caused with sustained fire. Their accounts matched in some details. Both attacked bombers. Both saw crashes but diverged on critical points. Holmes described chasing the second Betty into the ocean. Mitchell described the engagement from altitude, watching his cover flight hold off the Zeros while the killer flight attacked below. The intelligence officer transcribed everything, trying to build a coherent picture from 16 different perspectives of a 4-minute battle. It was messy. Combat always is, but the core facts were clear. Operation Vengeance had succeeded. Admiral Yamamoto was almost certainly dead, and somewhere in the wreckage cooling in Bougainville's jungle, the most important target of the Pacific War was being consumed by flies. The Japanese search party found the wreckage on April 19th, less than 24 hours after the crash. Local troops hacked through dense jungle guided by the smoke still rising from the impact site. What they discovered scattered across 200 yards of shattered trees was carnage. The Betty bomber had disintegrated on impact, flinging debris and bodies through the foliage. Admiral Yamamoto's body was located in the jungle undergrowth, still strapped to his seat, thrown clear when the fuselage broke apart. His white dress uniform was stained with blood from the 2 bullet wounds that had killed him. The Army surgeon who examined the body noted the entry wounds matched small-caliber aircraft gunfire. 50 caliber 20mm rounds. Death had been instantaneous or near instantaneous. Yamamoto probably never knew the P-38s were coming until the first bullets hit. Tokyo faced an immediate dilemma. Yamamoto's death was a catastrophic blow to military morale and national prestige. He was Japan's most famous military leader, more popular than the generals running the army, more trusted than the politicians running the government. His strategic genius had defined Japan's early war successes. Losing him was like losing a piece of the nation's soul. But announcing his death immediately would raise uncomfortable questions. How did American fighters know exactly where to find him? How did they intercept his plane so far from Allied bases? Was there a spy? Were the codes compromised? The Imperial General Headquarters decided on silence. They retrieved Yamamoto's body, cremated it, and said nothing publicly while they investigated the security breach. For 36 days, Japan's leadership maintained the fiction that Yamamoto was alive and actively commanding naval operations. Official communiques referenced his orders. Newspapers published fabricated reports of his inspections at various bases. The Americans, meanwhile, were desperate to confirm the kill, but couldn't announce it without revealing their coder-breaking capabilities. If Japan realized JN-25 was compromised, they'd change their codes overnight and blind American intelligence across the entire Pacific. So Washington stayed silent too, waiting for independent confirmation. The entire war hung on this secret, both sides knowing Yamamoto was dead, neither side willing to say so. The confirmation came through Australian coast watchers, Solomon Islanders working behind Japanese lines who reported everything they saw to Allied intelligence via hidden radios. On April 20th, a coast watcher near Bougainville reported increased Japanese military activity and rumors of a high-ranking officer killed in an air crash. On May 10th, another report mentioned a major funeral ceremony at Rabaul. The pieces started fitting together. Japanese radio intercepts showed unusual message traffic about Y's final disposition and arrangements for a state funeral. On May 21st, Tokyo Radio finally announced that Admiral Yamamoto had died heroically in April while directing operations at the front. The broadcast didn't mention he'd been shot down. It implied he'd died in combat, perhaps during a naval engagement, protecting his reputation and avoiding the embarrassing truth that American fighters had assassinated him in broad daylight. American newspapers exploded with the story on May 22nd. Headlines screamed about Yamamoto's death and the daring long-range fighter mission that killed him. The Navy Department released carefully sanitized details. 48 Lightnings from Guadalcanal had intercepted Japanese bombers near Bougainville on April 18th and destroyed both aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto was killed in the engagement. The press release didn't mention code reading, didn't mention the intercepted itinerary, didn't mention that American intelligence had known Yamamoto's schedule down to the minute. As far as the public knew, it was a lucky encounter. Good shooting by skilled pilots. The truth would remain classified for decades. But while the mission details stayed secret, the question of credit became immediately controversial. Who actually shot down Yamamoto's plane? Lanier's initial combat report claimed he'd attacked a Betty bomber from above, set it on fire, and watched it crash into the jungle. Barber's report claimed he'd pursued a Betty at low altitude, destroyed its right engine and wing, and watched it cartwheel into the trees. Both descriptions matched the crash site where Yamamoto's body was found. Both pilots claimed the kill. The Army Air Forces faced a problem. 2 pilots, 1 confirmed kill, and no objective way to determine who deserved credit. The official solution was a compromise that satisfied nobody. The AAF credited Landwehr with destroying Yamamoto's bomber, and credited Barber with destroying the second bomber that crashed in the ocean. Even though Besby Holmes had clearly shot down the ocean, Betty and multiple witnesses confirmed it. This arrangement gave Lanier the glory of killing Yamamoto, while giving Barber a consolation prize that didn't match what actually happened. Barber protested immediately. He knew what he'd shot, knew what he'd seen. Knew Holmes had killed the ocean bomber, but the AF had made its decision. Landwehr was officially credited with history's most important air-to-air kill. Barber would have to live with being forgotten. Lanier leveraged his official credit brilliantly. He toured the United States giving speeches, sold war bonds, met with politicians and celebrities, told and retold the story of how he'd personally killed the architect of Pearl Harbor. He was handsome, articulate, and told a compelling story. The press loved him. The public loved him. He became the face of Army Air Force's fighter operations in the Pacific. His fame opened doors after the war: business opportunities, political connections, media appearances. Being known as the pilot who killed Yamamoto was worth more than money. It was legacy, immortality, a guaranteed place in history books. Barber, meanwhile, returned to Oregon after the war and tried to resume normal life. He didn't give speeches. He didn't seek publicity. He just quietly insisted to anyone who asked that he'd shot down Yamamoto's bomber, and the official record was wrong. Most people dismissed his claims as sour grapes. Landwehr was the official hero. The government said so. Case closed. But other pilots from the mission supported Barber's version. Doug Canning's debriefing notes described seeing Barber attack the jungle bomber. Lewis K.D. stated he'd seen Barber's tracers hit the Betty. Even John Mitchell, the mission commander, eventually concluded that Barber had made the kill. But official records rarely change once written, and Lanier's version had been enshrined in Army Air Force's history. The controversy simmered for decades. Historians investigated interviewed surviving pilots, analyzed gun camera footage that didn't exist, studied Japanese records of the crash site. The evidence gradually shifted toward Barber. The bullet wounds on Yamamoto's body matched an attack from behind and below Barber's approach. The wreckage pattern suggested catastrophic structural failure of the right wing, consistent with Barber's sustained fire into that wing root. Landfer's claimed attack from above would have produced different wound angles and different damage patterns. By the 1980s, most serious historians concluded Barber had shot down Yamamoto, but Lanier never admitted it. He maintained his story until his death in 1987, insisting to the end that his gunshot killed the admiral. Barber lived until 2001, long enough to see historians vindicate his account, but not long enough to see the official record changed. The Air Force still credits Landfer with the kill in official histories, though most acknowledge the controversy and note that evidence supports Barber. It's an unsatisfying conclusion to an extraordinary mission, the most important fighter interception of World War II, forever tainted by disagreement about who actually pulled it off. Two men flew $1,000 men to execute one target. Both claimed credit. Only one could be right. And the truth died with them, buried under layers of incomplete records, faded memories, and the fog of war that obscures everything it touches. Japan never recovered from losing Yamamoto. Not strategically, the loss of 4 carriers at Midway had already crippled their offensive capabilities. But psychologically, Yamamoto had been the Empire's talisman, the genius admiral who understood modern warfare, the leader soldiers believed could pull victory from impossible odds. His death shattered that belief. The officers who replaced him were competent but conventional men who followed doctrine instead of rewriting it. They executed plans instead of creating brilliant new ones. The Imperial Navy's operational tempo slowed noticeably after April 1943. Fewer aggressive sorties, more defensive posturing, a creeping sense that initiative had permanently shifted to the Americans. The immediate tactical impact showed in the Solomon Islands campaign. Before Yamamoto's death, Japanese forces had mounted coordinated air-naval operations trying to retake Guadalcanal and isolate Australian supply lines. After his death, those operations became disjointed and reactive. Vice Admiral Janisaburo Ozawa, who inherited command of the combined fleet, was a capable officer, but lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision. Where Yamamoto had orchestrated complex, multi-carrier operations spanning thousands of miles, Ozawa focused on preserving his remaining ships. Preservation meant survival, but guaranteed defeat. You can't win a war by not losing. Japan needed aggressive action to disrupt American momentum. But aggressive action risked the precious few carriers they had left. So they waited, reacted, retreated incrementally, and died slowly. American forces exploited the vacuum ruthlessly. Admiral William Hawley's South Pacific campaign accelerated immediately after Yamamoto's death. New Georgia fell in August 1943. Bougainville, the very island where Yamamoto died, was invaded in November. The Japanese couldn't mount effective counterattacks because their naval air group ops had been gutted at Midway, and their leadership was paralyzed by caution. Halsey's forces leapfrogged up the Solomon chain, bypassing strong Japanese garrisons, isolating them, letting them wither. It was exactly the kind of operation Yamamoto might have countered if he'd lived. His successors just watched it happen. The psychological impact rippled through Japan's entire military structure. Yamamoto had been proof that Japan could compete with Western powers through superior spirit and clever strategy. His death suggested maybe they couldn't. Maybe American industrial might and technological superiority would grind them down regardless of how cleverly they fought. Japanese war planners had always known they couldn't match American production. Yamamoto himself had warned about that before the war, but they'd believed superior tactics and fighting spirit could compensate. Losing, the man who embodied those tactics undermined that belief. Morale in the combined fleet never fully recovered. Tokyo's 36-day cover-up probably made things worse. When the government finally admitted Yamamoto's death on May 21st, They'd created a month of rumors and speculation. Sailors had whispered about the admiral's absence. Officers had noted the sudden change in operational tempo. Everyone suspected something terrible had happened. The delayed announcement confirmed their fears and added an element of dishonesty. The government had lied to them for over a month. In a military culture built on honor and direct communication, that deception eroded trust. If the government would lie about Yamamoto, what else were they lying about? Were they lying about victories, about casualty figures, about the war's actual progress? The Americans, meanwhile, turned Yamamoto's death into a massive propaganda victory. Once Tokyo announced it, U.S. newspapers published detailed accounts of the mission. Magazine articles celebrated the P-38 pilots who'd flown $1,000 to execute Japan's greatest admiral. Newsreels showed P-38s taking off from Pacific bases, dramatizing the long-range interception. The message was clear. America could reach anywhere, killing one, no matter how far behind enemy lines they hid. If the architect of Pearl Harbor wasn't safe, nobody in the Japanese military was safe. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale, and it worked. Japanese commanders became more cautious about frontline inspections. Fewer admirals and generals risked flying near combat zones. That caution created distance between leadership and frontline troops, degrading the quality of operational planning. Strategically, Yamamoto's death accelerated Japan's defensive collapse. His replacement, Admiral Manichi Koga, inherited an impossible situation. Too few carriers, too few experienced pilots, too many defensive commitments spread across 5,000 mi of ocean. Koga tried to husband his strength for a decisive battle that never came. The Americans simply bypassed Japanese strongpoints and struck where defenses were weak. MacArthur's forces advanced through New Guinea, while Nimitz's forces drove through the Central Pacific. Japan's defensive perimeter, which had once stretched from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, contracted week by week. The battles that followed Philippine Sea in June 1944, Leyte Gulf in October 1944 were catastrophic Japanese defeats. The Navy lost 3 more carriers at Philippine Sea along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. Leyte Gulf cost them 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and effectively destroyed the combined fleet as a fighting force. Would Yamamoto have prevented those disasters if he'd lived? Probably not. The material imbalance was too severe, but he might have extracted a higher price from American advances. His successors fought conventionally. Yamamoto had specialized in the unconventional, the surprising, the attacks nobody expected. Japan needed that creativity in 1944, when American forces were smashing through their defensive lines. Instead, they had competent officers fighting by the book against an enemy who'd written a better book. The island-hopping campaign that defined 1944 and early 1945 proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Saipan fell in July 1944, giving the Americans air bases within B-29 range of Tokyo. Yoima fell in March 1945, providing emergency landing fields for damaged bombers. Okinawa fell in June 1945 after 3 months of horrific fighting. Each island brought American forces closer to the Japanese home islands and made the eventual invasion or surrender more inevitable. Japan's military leadership knew they were losing but couldn't find a way to stop it. They'd lost their strategic genius in April 1943, and everything afterward was just momentum, carrying the war to its inevitable conclusion. There's a haunting counterfactual buried in Operation Vengeance. If Rex Barber's bullets had missed by 6 in, if Yamamoto's pilot had turned right instead of left, if the drop tank malfunctions had forced mission cancellation, would the war have ended differently? Probably not fundamentally different. American industrial production would still have overwhelmed Japan. The atomic bombs would still have been developed and likely used, but the path might have been longer, bloodier, more costly in American lives. Yamamoto was the one Japanese leader who understood American capabilities and might have crafted defenses that extracted maximum casualties from every island invasion. His death removed that brilliant defensive mind from the chessboard. What followed was brutal attritional warfare where Japan lost every exchange because they simply had less to lose with. The 16 P-38 pilots who flew Operation Vengeance couldn't have known any of this on April 18, 1943. They just knew they had a target and a slim chance of reaching it. They flew $1,000 on hope and mathematics, found their target exactly where intelligence said it would be, and put enough bullets into Admiral Yamamoto's bomber to send it tumbling into the jungle. That single mission, 4 minutes of combat after 2 hours of navigation, changed the Pacific War's trajectory. Not by winning it outright, but by removing the one Japanese leader who might have made victory more expensive. Wars are decided by resources in production and logistics, but they're shaped by individuals. One man's brilliance or its absence can alter everything. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's absence after April 18, 1943, altered the Pacific War in ways both measurable and immeasurable, shortening the conflict and saving lives on both sides by eliminating the one commander who might have prolonged the agony. His death, delivered by a farm kid from Oregon flying a twin-engine fighter at the edge of its performance envelope, remains one of history's most consequential targeted killings. The price was calculated in bullets. The payment came in shortened war, fewer casualties, and one less genius trying to defeat the inevitable.